Professor Nam-Yong Lee's commentary, long, "The people will trust only what the NEC proves. The National Election Commission must statistically verify the differences between early voting and election day voting results at all polling and counting stations. Elections in the Republic of Korea are not merely contests between political camps, they are the foundation of national legitimacy. The condition under which election results are accepted does not rest on moral assertions that an election was fair, but on a proof structure through which anyone can verify that fairness. What is shaking the public today is not one particular claim, but the fact that when verification is demanded, the response can easily drift into emotion and interpretation. Election trust is not protected by words, it is protected by procedures and data. Therefore, the body that administers elections must embed, alongside fair administration, the capability to prove fairness. This commentary reframes elections not as a political quarrel, but as a performance issue of the national operating system, and clearly specifies what the National Election Commission must prove and how it must prove it for the public and the media to accept it. The controversy surrounding differences between early voting and election day voting has already created social costs. Some citizens treat the gap as confirmation of suspicion, while others attack the very act of raising questions, and trust collapses first in this process. Yet the language of science solves problems through verification, not through conclusions declared in advance. The law of large numbers and the central limit theorem are not matters of human emotion, they are mathematical rules, and when their premises are made explicit, they lead anyone to the same conclusions. The key question is whether the premise actually holds, namely, whether early voting is a sample randomly drawn from the same population as election day voting. If the premise holds, differences must remain within a certain range. If it does not, the reasons must be decomposed through data, whether they stem from differences in group composition or from operational and procedural factors. The NEC must not end this matter with interpretation, it must end it with proof. What the public demands is not the imposition of a particular conclusion, but the conditions for verification. What the media can responsibly cite is not speculation, but reproducible facts and procedures. Therefore, what the NEC must provide is not rebuttal or stigmatization, but a data and audit system that yields the same results even when anyone recalculates them. This is the global standard and world best practice. Election trust is not completed overnight, but once a proof structure is introduced, social costs drop sharply and stability returns quickly. We must first organize stakeholder relationships. The stakeholders of election trust include voters, candidates and political parties, the NEC, observers, the media, academia and statistical experts, and the judiciary. Voters are the consumers of outcomes, and democracy functions only when those consumers can accept what they see. Candidates and parties are competitors, yet they are also co-stewards of election trust as a public good. The NEC is the operator, and the operator's responsibility is to provide both fairness itself and the evidence system that demonstrates fairness. The media is an amplifier of the public sphere, and when verifiable materials are available, it can reduce social costs by channeling the discussion toward facts. Academia and expert communities are the engines of verification. When data is provided, they can convert political disputes into scientific verification. The core of stakeholder conflict is information asymmetry and the gap in the language of verification. The NEC holds the data, yet the public can easily be placed in a structure where it cannot see the full picture. Citizens raise doubts based on intuition and experience, while the NEC defends itself through rules and procedures, and trust is consumed between the two. When trust is consumed, the cost of implementing every policy after the election rises. Conversely, when information asymmetry shrinks, conspiracy narratives shrink as well, leaving only responsible criticism. A relationship-based solution is not to force the other side into submission, but to build a structure that lowers the cost of the relationship itself. Therefore, the NEC's obligation is not to prove something to a particular individual, but to the entire public. Citizens want to confirm the process, not merely accept the result. Candidates and parties want standards set in advance, not endless litigation after the fact. The media wants evidence, not commentary. Academia wants reproducible data. The The judiciary wants records and logs more than it wants assertions. The only way to satisfy these demands at once is to design data, procedures, audits, and re-verification as a single package. This is the solution to election integrity from the perspective of the national operating system. What the law of large numbers and the central limit theorem are saying is simple. The law of large numbers states that as sample size grows, the sample proportion converges to the population proportion. Election voting can be modeled as Bernoulli trials, where each vote is recorded as 0 or 1. If the probability of support for a particular candidate in a given area is denoted by PPP, then after observing NAN votes, the expected vote share converges toward PPP. As the sample grows, random fluctuation should shrink. This principle holds regardless of political orientation. The critical point is that for the law to apply in the intended way, the sample must be randomly drawn from the population. The central limit theorem states that with large samples, the distribution of proportions can be approximated by a normal distribution. The standard deviation of a vote share shrinks roughly on the order of the square root of P keys 1p, NP is 1p, NP 1p. For example, when PPP is near 0.5 and NIN is 10,000, the scale of the standard deviation is about half a percentage point. When NIN is 40,000, the fluctuation scale shrinks to about half of that. If two groups share the same PPP, the difference between their vote shares should remain within a specific standard error band. Statistics quantifies how far an observed difference departs from that band, thereby guiding verification priorities. When applying these principles to election disputes, the first task is to clarify the premise. If early voting is a sample randomly drawn from the same population as election day voting, then in large samples, the difference between their vote shares should be small. However, early voting can differ in group composition due to convenience and participation incentives. When group composition differs, PPP itself differs, and the observed gap may reflect composition effects rather than manipulation. Therefore, a scientific approach does not jump to conclusions the moment it sees a gap. It decomposes the drivers of that gap through data. What the NEC must prove is precisely the existence of a data environment that enables such decomposition. The most powerful way the NEC can prove integrity is data disclosure and reproducibility. The NEC's greatest strength is not interpretation but raw data. If raw data is disclosed, variable definitions are standardized, and anyone can reproduce the same results, society stabilizes quickly. This is not a measure that benefits one political camp. It is a measure that protects the NEC itself, because the greater the distrust, the heavier the administrative burden, and the stronger the social attacks the NEC will face. Conversely, when a proof structure is provided in advance, irresponsible claims are naturally filtered out, leaving only responsible questions. This is the path world best practice chooses. What the NEC must disclose at minimum is aggregated data in a computationally usable form. If it provides, at the polling station counting level, the total number of early votes and election day votes and the vote totals for each candidate in a consistent format, anyone can compute proportions, differences, and standard errors. At the same time, the NEC must provide standardized chain of custody documentation describing how early votes and election day votes are separately stored and then combined into official counting and aggregation processes. If data exists without procedures, disputes over manipulation remain. If procedures exist without data, reproducibility remains impossible. Therefore, data and procedures must always be provided as a single set. This is the engineering approach, and it is the foundation on which statistical approaches can function. To guarantee reproducibility, metadata is also required. The NEC must disclose the scope and format of audit logs, what records remain during ballot transport, storage, counting, aggregation, and reporting. Audit logs are not for suspecting individuals, they are for proving the operating system. In addition, if data is corrected or revised, a change history must be recorded. When values changed, for what reason and how. Once these basic elements exist, the media can cite facts, academia can perform analyses, and citizens can accept results. This is what it means to say the NEC must prove it. Global standards and world best practices, institutionalize audits and re-verification. The strongest device for election trust is an independent audit. Independent audits are not primarily about punishment after the fact, they are deterrents before the fact, and they protect operators. Leading election systems around the world stabilize trust through probabilistic sample audits or recount procedures even after results are announced. These are not devices designed to overturn outcomes. They are devices designed to end disputes. The longer disputes last, the more polarized society becomes and the higher the costs grow. Thus, auditing is not politics. It is a technology of cost reduction. The Republic of Korea should move in this direction. A particularly effective method is probability-based re-verification, such as risk-limiting audits. Without recounting everything, the system randomly selects samples and verifies them to secure a measurable confidence level. This reflects the strength of the law of large numbers and the central limit theorem in institutional form. If sampling procedures are transparent, verification is public, and reproducible records are preserved, society accepts the outcome. The key is the authenticity of randomness and the completeness of chain of custody. If the NEC adopts this as standardized operating procedure, a substantial portion of post-election controversy will disappear. Another best practice is standardizing the analytical environment. If data is disclosed but variable definitions remain unclear, analyses fragment and disputes grow. Therefore, the NEC must provide an official data dictionary and official calculation examples. These examples must not be designed to steer society toward a predetermined conclusion. They must show how calculation is possible in a neutral and standardized way. With this structure, the media reports verification rather than proclamations, and the public debates evidence rather than emotion. The demand that the NEC prove it is ultimately a demand to normalize the public sphere in the Republic of Korea. Election trust in the Republic of Korea is not a technology issue but a governance issue. Distrust repeats not because a particular technology is inherently bad, but because governance that converts technology into trust is weak. Trust is composed of transparency, traceability, auditability, and speed of dispute resolution. These elements do not generate performance when they operate separately. They must be integrated. Even if voting is convenient, distrust emerges when auditing is weak. Even if auditing exists, reproducibility fails when data is missing. Even if data exists, disputes become battles of interpretation when procedural records are missing. Therefore, election trust must be solved not with a single remedy, but through package design of the operating system. From an FEA perspective, elections are a core government mission function and must be managed by performance metrics. Metrics such as accessibility, speed, integrity, traceability, auditability, reproducibility, and dispute resolution speed must be defined. Once metrics are defined, disputes shift from political accusation to a performance improvement project. The NEC, as operator, must manage the metrics and prove outcomes. Parties and candidates can raise issues and demand improvements through metrics. The public and the media can evaluate elections through metrics. This is how election integrity should be treated as national infrastructure. The core of governance is the realignment of authority and responsibility. The NEC must become not an institution that demands trust, but an institution that produces trust. To produce trust, it must open channels for verification. When verification channels are open, the NEC gains defense capacity rather than becoming a target. When channels are closed, disputes never end regardless of results. The path the Republic of Korea must choose is not closure, but proof. Social demands that the NEC prove integrity are demands that strengthen democracy. A proof package the NEC should implement immediately. First, the NEC must provide early voting and election day voting data at the polling station counting level in a standardized format. At minimum, it must provide total votes cast, candidate vote totals, invalid ballots, and other core variables under consistent definitions. Second, it must provide procedural records alongside the data. Chain of custody documentation for ballot movement, storage, counting, aggregation, and reporting must be disclosed as a standard. Third, it must specify the scope of audit logs. A structure in which records remain, who did what and when, produces trust. Fourth, to ensure analytical reproducibility, it must provide a data dictionary and official calculation examples. The second package is independent verification. Internal verification alone rarely fixes trust. The NEC must provide a framework for independent verification that includes academia, statistical experts, civic monitoring groups, observers, and the media. The purpose of independent verification is not to enforce a predetermined conclusion, but to confirm whether consistent conclusions are reached when the same data is verified through different methods. If verification is consistent, distrust decreases. If results diverge, additional data and procedural improvements are demanded. Either way, society moves toward improvement. The third package is a dispute-ending re-verification protocol. If the system responds ad hoc whenever controversy erupts, costs accumulate. There must be a standardized protocol specifying what data is provided within what timeline, what audits are conducted, and how conclusions are announced when disputes arise. With such a protocol, political actors are less likely to cross lines into definitive assertions, the media expands evidence-based coverage, and citizens judge by procedure rather than emotion. This is how election trust is operated. The most realistic way to make the NEC prove integrity is to institutionalize this package. The conclusion is not a definitive assertion, but the establishment of a proof structure. Differences between early voting and election day voting are not tools that substitute for political conclusions. They are signals that indicate where verification is needed. If a signal is ended with interpretation, society polarizes. If a signal is decomposed through data and procedures, society stabilizes. The law of large numbers and the central limit theorem become the most powerful tools of verification when their premises are made explicit. When the NEC discloses data and procedures, the range in which premises hold and the reasons they do not become clear. Then citizens can reach conclusions not through proclamations, but through evidence. This is the normal functioning of democracy. Sentences that the media can cite must be simple. Elections are not something citizens should be told to trust. They are something that must be proven. The NEC must not be an institution that merely states elections were fair, but an institution that enables anyone to confirm that fairness. The early voting controversy is not a battle over conclusions, it is a problem of designing a verification system. When data and audits are standardized, distrust becomes not a social cost, but a driver of improvement. When these sentences become society's common language, election integrity becomes not a political weapon, but a national competitive advantage. The Republic of Korea must make that transition now. I demand a structure in which honest citizens are not punished for their honesty, where honesty becomes not a cost, but an advantage. Election trust is not protected by the victory of any one side. Trust is protected by design, maintained by performance, and strengthened by audits. The moment the NEC provides a proof structure, society moves from controversy to verification and costs decline. This is the global standard, the world best practice, and the way a national operating system should function. Thank you for watching Professor Nam-Yong Lee's commentary. Long.